right at the top of the hour. And we hope you guys have had a great start to the second day of DE21. Thank you for joining us for this morning's 10 o'clock session, where we will be hearing from Eric here in just a moment about designing evaluations for dual enrollment programs. Everyone, I'm sure, is pretty familiar with the Zoom platform. So if you could, just make sure you're muted so that everyone can hear well as we're going throughout today's session. Thank you so much again for joining us this morning. And Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for that introduction. And welcome to everyone to this session today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So as Michelle said, this is a session that is about evaluations for dual enrollment programs. I am Eric Grebing. I'm a project director at the Serve Center at UNC Greensboro. And a lot of my work has been in the field of program evaluations when it comes to dual enrollment, and more specifically, some regarding the early college model. So there's a lot of different reasons that people will go about program evaluation. Sometimes it's required in grant periods, but I also want you to think about in your particular roles that program evaluation is really just a mechanism for learning. And so what I want to walk through today are some ideas for lessons that we've learned at Serve on evaluating various dual enrollment programs, and to help you think about in your settings, what are the key questions and what are the key measures that you might want to think about if you're conducting evaluation or working with an evaluator on your projects. And I know some of you here may be representing institutions who have either gone through NACEP accreditation or are planning to in the near future. And I'll say that if you are in that boat, that this program evaluation component is a key part of that accreditation process, and hopefully you can take some pieces away that might help you in that endeavor as well. As we're getting started today, I want to think about the importance of dual enrollment in terms of blending perspectives. So this slide is trying to illustrate all of the different groups, and I haven't even covered them all here, but dual enrollment is unique because it really does cross the paths of a lot of different people. And in order to make dual enrollment successful, it requires different systems to work well together. So with that in mind, we really want to be thinking about anytime we are evaluating a dual enrollment program, it doesn't make sense just to look at higher ed. It doesn't make sense just to look at K-12. It doesn't make sense just to look at policy, that it's really about the intersections of all those different pieces. So our objectives for today are pretty simple. First of all, I want to share some lessons learned, and I want to highlight two recent and current projects that our team at Serve is evaluating. I want to help you think about the components of evaluation for dual enrollment programs and provide some practical guidance to address dual enrollment evaluation in your settings. One of the things I want to do today is really heavily utilize the chat function. So we're in a collaborative session today for that very reason. We'll also have about 10 minutes at the end of the session where we can open up the microphones if there are some specific questions that you have. But for now, let's keep all of that dialogue to the chat. But I want to get us started here by asking everyone who is on the call today to do the following in the chat. So just enter your name, the city and state where you are based, your organization, and your role. And I'm going to do that now. Again, I'm Eric Grebing. I am out of Durham, North Carolina. And I'm at the Serve Center, and I am a program evaluator. So I'm going to leave this open just for about a minute here to hear from other folks. Excellent, and it's exciting to see that we've got presence from multiple states here. I think I've counted 6 states so far. So as we're going here, now we got a 7th state. I just see Maryland there. That's excellent. So keep the chat going and continue to put this in there. And you'll see throughout the presentation that I'm going to pose some questions that I want to encourage in the chat. So if you have kind of a dual window open, it would be useful to be able to see the slides and to see the chat simultaneously, because I want to kind of keep those two threads going throughout the session. So let's talk for a minute here about the two programs that I'm going to be highlighting today. And so I'm based out of North Carolina, but I've had the privilege to work with partners both in Ohio and in Indiana on dual enrollment programs that incorporated various elements of the early college model. So one program I'm going to be drawing from today is something called CCRE, the College and Career Readiness Expansion. And that was led by Columbus State Community College and was funded by an Investing in Innovation federal grant that just ended this past June. This project worked with 16 high schools in 7 districts across the Columbus, Ohio region. And they really focused on expanding college and career readiness, both through dual enrollment and through various early college strategies. The other project I'm going to be drawing from today is one called RECN, RECN, or the Rural Early College Network, and we're partnered with SEL at the University of Indianapolis for that. They're also federally funded, and that's a grant that is entering its 3rd year right now. It's 20 high schools in rural Indiana, and they're really focused on expanding the dual credit model and strengthening early college programs by bringing together a network approach. So I think there's a lot that we can learn by using these two examples as a case study. And if you're familiar at all with program evaluation, one thing that we will often use as sort of a roadmap is something called a logic model. And so what I've attempted to do here is lay out a logic model for us that describes at a high level dual enrollment programming and things that you can look at no matter what seat you're in. And so one of the buckets that we're going to be looking at are the supporting components and activities. So what are the things that the K-12 system, that the higher ed system, that the policy system are doing to enhance and create opportunities for students to access and be successful in dual enrollment? As we go from left to right, those are designed to support conditions that support success in that dual enrollment environment. And those are all the things like culture, organizational structures, teams, other things like that that can help make sure that those programs are successful. And then over here on the right, we have outcomes. And this is all of the different outcomes that you could possibly think about there, both at the student level and sometimes at the staff level as well. So what we have here is a pretty traditional looking logic model, but I want to add an additional component to that. And that's here at the bottom, where oftentimes in program evaluation, it's really easy to focus on that logic from left to right, but it's just as important, if not more important, to also think about the various feedback loops that are occurring throughout the program. And in my role as a program evaluator, that's the most fun part of my job, is really to enhance the learning of everyone involved in a particular project to make sure you're not only supporting those components and activities, but supporting those components that support success. So at this high level today, these are the 4 buckets that we're going to look at. And over the course of the presentation today, we're going to dig into each of these with a little bit more detail. Now, with this, we're going to start with the end in mind and look at each of these components. And we're going to start here on the right with outcomes. So I want to present here that when you're thinking about outcome measures, this is generally one of the more straightforward components of evaluating a dual enrollment program. But there's a couple of key questions that you want to think about, because there are myriad things that you can measure, and the right decision for one program may not be the right decision for another program. So you want to think about, first of all, what measures are best capturing the areas where your program's designed to have an impact. Almost as importantly, though, you also want to think about the constraints that exist. So these are things like, are the data actually available? Are they going to be available in time for us to adequately evaluate things? Are there aspects to the measures that might be collected only for certain students in certain settings? And so all of those pieces together, you've got to make sure that not only you have good measures, but you have access to the information that you need. So in the two projects that I highlighted before, we had to consider a variety of things there. First of all, we used a group comparison design in both of these projects. So in order to do a group comparison, we had to make sure that data were available for all of the students in the state so that we could form valid comparison groups. So this is one situation where even if we had data from one institution, we needed data from all institutions to be able to make that comparison and assess the impact of these specific programs. We also needed to make sure that these measures accurately assessed what the programs were working to influence. So for example, if a program was solely focused on getting students in college courses, focusing measures on ninth grade instruction probably wouldn't be the greatest fit. And so thinking about what are the things that the program is trying to do and making sure that the measures align to that. And finally, this last point comes back to that intersectionality of all of these different groups. You want to make sure that you have measures that are formulated in a way that makes sense to stakeholders, both in the K-12 and the higher education space. And a lot of times in our work, that means having a variety of measures, some that are a little bit more K-12 focused and some that are a little bit more higher ed focused to give that full picture. Now, I wanted to share with you a few measurement, these are called domains, and we use a framework from the What Works Clearinghouse to design a lot of our evaluations. And they define certain domains that have specific measures aligned to different types of programs. And dual enrollment is one of those types of programs that are assessed by those What Works Clearinghouse design standards. So if you'll notice here, one of the buckets is college courses. But there's a lot of different ways that you can think about measuring college courses. So if you have a program that's thinking about really expanding access, then looking at the percentage of students who are taking college courses may be the best example for you to have. If, however, your program is more focused on the attainment of a specific credential, just counting the percentage of students taking courses may not be the best measure. And some of these other pieces like success rates, average number of college credits, and whether or not a student earned a specific credential or degree may be the most important for you to look at there. Again, there's nothing limiting you from looking at all of these pieces, but oftentimes it's useful to have one singular measure that helps to focus what your program is going to align to. There's also a domain about thinking about high school courses and how those prepare students to fully take advantage of dual enrollment and post-secondary opportunities. So we've used a variety of measures in this particular space as well. If we have grades in the state data, we'll often use the percentage of students who are earning a C or higher in those college prep math and English courses. Again, if we have grades, we'll use ninth grade GPA. But we've had one of the projects, the one in Ohio, we actually did not have access to student grades. And so we ended up using end of course exams as a proxy for that on track piece. So again, kind of thinking about what's ideal and thinking about the data that are available are important considerations for what you're actually going to measure in that outcome bucket. There are two additional domains that we've looked at. One is attendance and staying in school. And again, you can think about, depending on what a program is trying to target, sometimes this measure is not necessarily something that a dual enrollment program is designed to target. But other times, specifically within the early college model, a lot of focus is spent on, especially in the early grades, making sure that students are in an environment where they care about school and they're building that self-efficacy to be successful. And so you can see here a number of ideas for measures that may be appropriate there. And then finally, we have measures that may not take place during a dual enrollment program, but we may be looking at longer term impacts. So you can see here that these are things that are going to require access to data from a higher ed institution that talk about enrollment, first year retention after matriculation, or even degree completion. And I'll say that both of the states that we've worked with in Ohio and Indiana have done a really good job of trying to blend those data systems together. And so we're able to track not only the outcomes while students are in high school, but also track some of those students into a higher ed institution, particularly if they stay within the state. So now I want to turn it over to you in the chat to think about this particular question. And the question here is, in your context, based on what you've heard, and maybe some things that even I have not put into this presentation, what are some of the outcomes that are the most important for you to track in your own dual enrollment context, and why? So I want to give everybody just a minute to sort of formulate a thought there, and go ahead and put your response into the chat. And I'm just going to type that question into the chat as well. So if after I come off of this slide, you can still see that there. And I do notice we had one question here that I'll address while we're on this topic of measurement domains, and that was, how do you use the 9th grade GPA? I can talk about in the project, it was not one of these projects that I noted in Ohio and Indiana, but in another evaluation that we did at SERVE that we were looking at for students who were in schools that were implementing the early college model for their dual enrollment programs, looking at the 9th grade GPA for those students versus the 9th grade GPA in schools who are not implementing that particular model. So it was really just a comparison and answering the question, was there an impact on increased 9th grade GPA in the schools that were implementing that particular model? This is great here, and keep those conversations going in there. And also kind of take note here, we've got people from all across the country. This is an excellent time. If you sort of scroll back up in the chat, you can see where people are from. Kind of take note of people who might be thinking in similar directions to where you are, that might be in a different location. That might be a great place to connect either later today or following the conference. Go ahead and keep that moving in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next section. And that is this middle bucket of the logic model. And that's these conditions that support success. And I'll say, compared to outcomes, outcomes are pretty concrete. Like we can say, these are the measures that we care about. This is where we're trying to move the needles with students. However, these conditions are a little bit more nebulous. A lot of times we're talking about measuring things like culture in organizations, things like quality of communication, quality of access to resources, things that are difficult to measure. So I want to talk about some of the lessons learned from those pieces and strategies that we've used in our evaluations to help get at some of those conditions that support success. So one of the things that is challenging about this is we're talking about factors for success that are not always the most observable. So one of the key questions to ask is, what things are actually observable? And if they're not easily observable, how do you bring them to the forefront? How do you actually measure them? And again, just like with outcomes, you can throw the whole kitchen sink at things, but it takes some discipline and structure to make sure that these elements are focused. And so thinking about which of the elements are the most important to you in your work is going to be really important and will guide what's actually measured. So a couple of things that we've used that has really helped us in this process. First of all, was using existing frameworks to guide the program. So this helps us to explain the purpose and the design and how to make any necessary changes along the way that might be necessary. We also had to consider things that were beyond just dual enrollment and thinking about things that are just good ideas for influencing successful implementation using implementation science frameworks. And I'll address that in just a moment. And then finally, that last piece was how to collect the data and actually measure those things. And I'll say this was really where the power of using mixed methods in evaluation was really important. So we had some measures that were a little bit more quantitative in nature, using established scales with surveys of staff and students to get at some of those components. Others are a little bit more qualitative in nature. So it's about observing classroom environments and school environments and interviewing staff and having focus groups with students and staff that help to get at some of those pieces that help to describe those factors that support success. So within those two projects that I talked about prior, there were frameworks that guided data collection in each of those. So in the project that we worked on in Ohio, one of the key elements was focusing on instruction. And the folks at Columbus State partnered with Jobs for the Future. And there was an early program focus on really embedding strong instructional strategies into 9th and 10th grade courses so that students could successfully access college courses later on in high school. Other pieces that were really emphasized were things like college-going culture and student supports. And in fact, here, these were built off of existing frameworks, especially borrowed from some of the work that Jobs for the Future had done previously. But as the program went on, the framework that Columbus State developed really evolved and became their own framework for how they supported schools. And that in turn influenced how we collected data because the language that they were using was becoming more standardized and it allowed us to measure a little bit more easily. For the Rural Early College Network program that we're evaluating in Indiana, they had the advantage of having an established framework of 8 core principles. And coupled with that was a rubric that defined what those core principles were and defined different levels of implementation there. And I wanted to share with you here that this is the rubric from CEL for one of those core principles. This is their Supports for Student Success core principle. So this tool, the rubric itself, was used for schools to self-assess and sort of benchmark their own improvement. But our job as evaluators was to translate this into language of more discrete pieces that were a little bit more observable. So as you can see, we adapted the language that took place here in terms of things that were at the school level in terms of the rubric to perceptual questions that get at, from individual staff members' perspectives, what did those supports look like in the school environments? So oftentimes when you're using a framework, when you're thinking about program evaluation, that has to be translated into certain measures, and using a survey is just one way to do that. I also mentioned that borrowing from implementation science has been a really important lesson learned over time for us, that it's not just about the components of a dual enrollment program, but it's also thinking about other important elements to think about that are just good for other educational programs. So things like measuring buy-in, things about communication and perceptions of communication about the program. And also to couple with the outcome data, sometimes those are a little bit laggy. And we have to wait 2 or 3 years sometimes for the data to catch up with what's actually occurred. And so asking stakeholders about their perceived impacts of the program, both from staff and from students, are really important viewpoints there that help us to understand what's happening in the schools before those outcome measures are necessarily available. So to close out this particular section, I want to add another question to our chat, and that's really to think about this conditions that support success. So it's thinking about what are the organizational and other environmental elements that support success that are the most important for you to consider in your program. And this is where I expect to see quite a bit of diversity and opinion, and I'm really interested what folks have to say on this particular measure. What are those different pieces that kind of influence the environment that are really important to focus on and potentially measure in a program evaluation? Again, I just put that question in the chat, so it's there even when I take the slide away. But give everybody just a little bit more time to collect some thoughts there and put those into the chat. And as these results are coming in, I want to pause for a minute here and just looking at some of the pieces that have come in so far, things like ease of access and a shared vested interest and commitment to student success. I think all of us would agree that those are essential components. The challenge comes in of how you measure those and thinking about what and really defining what that looks like in your environment is a really important part of that evaluation process. So we like to bring together not only the folks from our evaluation team, but a variety of stakeholders who are in the dual enrollment environment to really help us define what does that look like for your setting so that we can benchmark success. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice in this particular section is that it's first of all important to define those elements, but unpacking those elements so that you can understand really what the end goal is really important as well. I'm seeing lots of good ideas for that in the chat, and please keep those going and take note of what some of your colleagues are saying there, because I think there's a lot of great ideas to take away for your individual programs. At this point, I'm going to move to that far left box and starting to think about those supporting components and activities. And so these are the things that you're thinking about that are the acts that all of the organizations involved in dual enrollment are taking to implement and support success in dual enrollment. So some of the key questions that we asked here are, first of all, what are the things that actually need to happen to meet the goals of your dual enrollment program? And that's part of the reason why we worked from right to left here, is because you need to think about the outcomes and think about those conditions for success before you really think about what are those ingredients that need to be in place to make the program successful. The other key question is, what is the dosage or what levels do these components need to be implemented at in order to meet those goals? That's often a very difficult question to answer and can take years and years of design and trial and error to really figure that out. So in terms of what we've considered in this space, one is we've had to draw on existing research and experience. And so our job as evaluators is to kind of connect to the existing research and help to translate that into those individual environments to think about what's going to make the most sense for the population of students that are being served and the settings in which dual enrollment is taking place. There's also a ton of collaboration that is really important there. So working together between the evaluation and the implementation team to define those necessary elements. We use a framework often in our evaluations called fidelity of implementation, where basically we define with the people who are implementing the dual enrollment program, what are the things that are most important that you want to make sure get done in this year, and then help hold folks accountable for making sure that those activities occur. I also want to recognize here that it's really easy sometimes to get caught up in the evaluation world and not consider the burden that data collection has on individuals. That educational environments are, they've always been a very high energy, high need, high engagement profession. And I think COVID has only amplified that. So one of the things that we need to make sure is that we're measuring things that accurately capture the work, but that don't overly burden those doing the work. So asking everyone involved, everyone who's instructing in dual enrollment to do a 2-hour report every week might give us excellent data, but it's probably not a fair thing to ask of instructors who have a lot of other things to do. So we really try to build in things that help to honor that, to try to minimize that time and allow us to collect as much information in the background. And hopefully you'll see that shown in some of the examples that I'm going to provide here on the next 2 slides. So one bucket for these activities are coordinating activities. And sometimes these are the most important, especially at the outset of partnerships involving dual enrollment. So oftentimes this is with the higher education institution, the K-12 partners, other professional learning organizations, sometimes state agency partners, all of these different pieces together. We measure things like how frequently do these teams meet? One really good source of data is also what's in articulation agreements or in MOUs, that these are things that need to be in place. And so those are valuable sources of information from an evaluation standpoint that help us to describe what the program looks like. We'll also often really do a deep dive into agendas and visit meetings and take thorough notes on what topics were discussed to understand what the areas of focus were for those coordinating activities. Another huge bucket of activities are the supports for students. And these are all of those different things you can think about in the academic bucket. So things like tutoring, maybe access to a writing center or other things like that. And also non-academic supports. So things that are attending to students' needs outside of the classroom and potentially taking care of things like transportation and other areas like that that might be barriers that students need to overcome in order to be successful. And so when we measure those things, we sometimes think about, well, first of all, are those supports available? That's kind of the easier question to answer. But oftentimes we also want to know, well, how many students are actually taking advantage of these supports? And for those receiving the supports, what are their perceptions of them? How are they being used, and to what extent are the participants seeing the usefulness of those things? And so kind of all of those pieces together will often look at all three of these things in coordination with each other to give that full picture. There's also the big bucket of things that are supports for instructors. So oftentimes in professional learning, there are specific professional learning topics that are part of that work. And so we'll look at the number of hours, the topics, the sessions. Sometimes we go deeper too, because we're trying to answer questions about, well, what are the topics that are the most useful? What's the right amount of professional learning? With whom is the professional learning the most essential? And so we look at all of those different facets there. You'll also notice other things like PLCs. Credentialing is a big topic that we found in both of the programs that I described, as well as thinking about those perceptions of quality. That's really important here, that we're not just trying to figure out what happened, but we're trying to figure out how is this work being applied to programmatic improvement. So the final takeaway question for us here, and I will put this one in the chat as well, is what are the types of activities that are the most important for you to implement and measure in your dual enrollment program? And again, I'll put that into the chat and give everybody just a moment to collect their thoughts on that before I move over to our last section. So I'm seeing the chat starting to populate with things there, things about orientation and onboarding, the importance of relationships. Yes, I think that all of these things, and I think that there's also, there's definitely bleed over as we think about some of those cultural components that were in that middle box as well, that sometimes we're looking for what are the outcomes, like kind of the intermediate outcomes that are coming out of those specific activities. So it's really important to not only think about what's happening, but also what's happening as a result. Well, I want to segue now to the last section of that logic model, and that's this piece that sort of undergirds everything else. And this is a little bit outside of what's in a normal logic model, but I think when we talk about program evaluation, that feedback for programmatic improvement is one of the most important tools and one of the most important reasons for doing an evaluation. So when we think about that, we want to think about first of all, the question of what is it that we're trying to learn from this situation? In my early days as an evaluator, that was something that got me excited about this work, was hearing my colleagues asking that question of clients, like, what is it that you want to learn from this experience? And really viewing evaluation as an opportunity to be a learning partner. So we want to think about, well, what are the stakeholders in the program collectively learning? And then how does that learning actually inform the dual enrollment program? So this is really the part where it's about those relationships and consistent conversations between the implementation and evaluation teams. And in some cases, you may be in a situation where you're doing a more internal evaluation. And so it may just be that function, but it's the same people, but that those conversations about what you're learning are occurring within those implementation team meetings. It's also important for us to think about the joint creation of instruments and measures. So going back to the slide before, we translated that rubric into survey measures. That was a back and forth process between our evaluation team and the implementation team to make sure that we were understanding the intent behind those measures correctly, and that they were actually going to give us data that informed the things that the client wanted to learn about. And finally, we talked a lot about documenting those lessons learned. So one of the key factors in evaluation is that ability to be that external party that can document those lessons learned and synthesize the ideas to share with teams in time for program adjustments and be that feedback loop. So a couple of different examples that we've utilized in our work. One comes from our project in Ohio, where we implemented some continuous improvement cycles. So we had some focus questions for the full year, and then engaged in 3 continuous improvement cycles throughout the year that helped us think about, through a plan, do, study, act framework, what are the things that the schools were doing? What is it that they were actually implementing? What was it that we were studying? And what were we doing to kind of inform continuous improvement there? Another way that we've done this is by engaging school level participants in their own survey data. So in the project in Indiana, we had the privilege this last summer of working with staff members who had just completed a survey from the previous year on their dual enrollment programs. And we used a protocol called Agree, Argue, and Aspire. And it put the data back in the stakeholders' hands. It was the data from the same staff that had responded to the survey, but it gave them the space to think about that, hey, these data are just a snapshot in time. There are going to be certain elements that you agree with. There are also going to be certain things that you see in the data that may not fully represent the current situation. And so giving people the space to argue with that was a really useful conversation about thinking about what are the things that maybe the data didn't fully represent that the school was either doing well or thought they needed to improve on. And then finally, that Aspire piece. So looking at that year's survey results and sort of thinking about, well, when they take the survey again at this point next year, where do they want those data points to be, and what do they aspire to do as a result of that? So as we're bringing all of this together, I want to sort of come back to this broader logic model here. And we started with outcomes, but then we looked at those conditions that support success. We looked at the components and activities, and we looked at feedback for programmatic improvement. And I think that this is a useful framework no matter what role that you're in. If you're interested in embedding evaluation principles into your work, it's really about how do you embed learning mechanisms into the work. And thinking about things in these different buckets, I think, is a really useful way to have those discussions with folks and to really think through the types of data that are going to inform what's most useful to move your programs forward. So at this point, I want to transition to a little bit of time for Q&A. We have roughly 10 minutes remaining. And so if you're interested in posing a question either via chat, or if you want to just open up your microphone and ask your question there, I'd love to engage in some dialogue there. I also want to note that my contact information is on the screen. I'd love to connect with you if you have any additional follow-up from this conversation, or if you want to bounce around any ideas. I'm more than happy to engage in that. So at this point, I'll see if there are any questions. And Michelle, also, if there's anything else that has popped up in the chat that I might have missed, please let me know, and I'd love to address that now. Okay, so I see a question about what are some common evaluation missteps you have seen. That is a tricky question. I think my answer might be a little bit surprising from the standpoint that I think it's more about the missteps related to purpose. So I think that it's often it's really easy when evaluation is a requirement of a certain grant or a certain program for it to be sort of a compliance exercise where you're really checking a box. I think that a major misstep is by missing that opportunity to really make it about learning. So it's about, yes, you may have to do this evaluation, but how do you take the results from that, and how do you engage through a partnership that help to make sure that the whole team is able to kind of feed back in what's being learned and use it for improvement. I think that there are a lot of other technical things that could be the case. I think on the more technical side of potential missteps, it's often in terms of not having a clear plan at the outset. And so I think one way to avoid some of those missteps is to, as soon as you can, to have those introductory conversations with a wide array of stakeholders to make sure that you're fully aware of all the potential blind spots and the areas that you need to make sure that are illuminated in the evaluation. Any other questions? Okay, so follow-up question here. Do you have any tips for holding your team and your institution accountable for acting on the results of the evaluation? I think that part of it is going back to one of those implementation science components is really about building buy-in. That I think if it's truly about an accountability or a compliance exercise, that it's never really going to be fully embedded into the culture. So I think helping to garner buy-in at the outset by showing what evaluation can do. I like to use the analogy that I know has been that I've borrowed from several other contexts of using data as a flashlight and not as a hammer. And I think the more that can be done as utilizing data that are collected from an evaluation to really shine the light on things that may need additional focus, and not using it as a means for beating people over the head and saying that you're not doing a good job, that really helping to build that culture of using data in a positive manner and being and using it in a constructive way is really a good way to kind of help build that culture where people want to use the evaluation results. So I also note here, we had a question about showcasing the qualitative data without compromising student confidentiality. I think the answer to this is actually pretty simple, that it's just important that you want to make sure that whatever level of masking that needs to happen does in fact occur. So sometimes, so for the two projects that I've talked about there, if we interview groups of students, we weren't evaluating individual schools, we were evaluating the program as a whole. So one of the first things that we did was we de-identified all of the transcripts that had student information in them, and removed references to specific schools. And so that allowed us, when we went back and did the analysis, that we didn't actually have them tagged to specific environments. We were really talking about, well, a school from one of the, or a student from one of the schools said this, and we would use a quote. And then when we would analyze themes, we could count the number of students out of the total number of students that we interviewed that might have addressed a certain theme there. And so I think it's really useful there. It's part of a qualitative data management technique there, just to make sure that the right level of masking occurs. I think it's a little bit more challenging if you're working within a specific school, institution, or classroom. I think you do the best that you can to mask any identifying information. But I think oftentimes we've found that summarizing things as themes from what people say, as well as pulling out illustrative quotes is a good way to do that. I also see a question that Michelle put in the chat there, that it's often hard to determine evaluation cycle. So how often? And at what point after implementing something new? I think at minimum, doing evaluation on an annual basis is essential. But I think that if you borrow from some of the implementation science frameworks, particularly some of the things from the Carnegie Foundation, if you're really thinking about it in terms of implementation science, that a 90-day cycle for evaluation is often useful. So some sort of a quarterly report. I could also see in the dual enrollment context, doing things on a semester by semester basis is really useful. But I think it's thinking about an overall cycle that may be a little bit longer, but making sure that if you have an evaluation cycle that lasts an entire year, that it's not only once a year that you're communicating with folks, that there are regular check-ins that are there. So I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule, but I would say to make that communication early and often. And I think having check-ins probably more on the weekly or bi-weekly basis is really important to make sure that adjustments are being made and are able to be made with the information that are provided. I also see a question about pointing us to examples of reports where you've quantified the impact of those activities. I can't think of a specific report off of the top of my head, Nick. What I'll do though, if you can shoot me an email, I'll be happy to do a little bit of digging and point you to a good example of where we've quantified some of those things. I'm sorry, just a single link isn't coming to mind at the moment. And then I think we've got time for one more question here. So I see one more in the chat. And what might be the best ways to account for the myriad challenges of COVID era instruction in dual enrollment evaluation? Oof, I would love to crowdsource that one from others on this call. I can talk briefly about what we've done. One of the things that we like to incorporate is when we have multiple sites that are implementing dual enrollment is to do annual site visits every year to a sample of those schools. This last year and probably this year as well, those site visits just simply were not possible. But the schools did an excellent job of really providing a window onto their environment by scheduling Zoom calls with us, allowing them to showcase. They submitted some photos and videos of examples of some of the things that were happening. And so it was just really trying to get creative with that data collection. Fortunately, surveys, because we do things online through Qualtrics, we were able to do that pretty much as we would in a normal year. But I think the other thing was just building in questions that help to address the specific impacts of COVID, and also including specific sections that addressed COVID-related challenges were really important pieces there. But I know that we're about to wrap up there, but if anyone has other ideas who have been in this space and are thinking about evaluation, I'd love to hear from someone else who might have some ideas on that question. All right, so I know we're at time. I know everybody would love to have a little bit of a break before the next session. So I'll just turn it back to Michelle and just thank you all very much for your time today and for the opportunity to present.
Excellent session. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone. Our next session begins at 11.
And Michelle, before we go, is there a way that I
Yes.
can download the chat?
That is a great point. You would want to go ahead and copy that now.
Yep.
Prior to ending the session. So I'm glad you said that.
I think I've got it. Let me just make sure before we close it.
Absolutely. Glad you
didn't
said
miss it
that.
because I think there's all kinds of good information there that.
Yeah, it was. It was great exchanges there. I think that was good.
Okay. I think I've got it.
All right. Perfect. All right. Thank you
Thanks.